The odds of a wider war in the Middle East just went up precipitously. Israel and Hezbollah, the Iranian-backed militant group based in Lebanon, have been playing a game of cat and mouse, lobbing missiles at one another, teasing each other in advance of a potential future strike.
There may have been a tipping point over the weekend when a rocket hit a soccer field in the Golden Heights. Now, the northern land that borders Syria and is home to an Arab Druze community, 12 children were killed and dozens more were injured. Israel and the United States say the attack came from Hezbollah. So will this trigger a wider war where both sides will mobilize and intensify fighting? Here to unpack all of this and explain what could happen next is Quincy Institute's Trita Parsi. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So, of course, there's still war in Gaza escalating. Is this a moment where Netanyahu and the IDF is focused on Gaza and it's created this void that Hezbollah is taking advantage of? What do you make of this? And how does it relate to Netanyahu's decision-making as the leader of Israel?
I don't think this is as a result of a void because of Gaza. What happened is that after the war in Gaza, you saw Hezbollah start, there's already been an exchange of fire on a very low scale between Hezbollah and Israel for quite some time. It's almost like a codified conflict that they have in which both of them know how far not to go in order not to escalate it. That, of course, ended up being escalated following October 7th. What's important to keep in mind, though, however, is that 83% of the missiles that have been exchanged between Israel and Hezbollah since October 7th has been coming from Israel. And there's been a concern in the U.S. government from the very outset that the Israelis wanted to go after Hezbollah already in early October, immediately after October 7th, which would very likely drag the entire region into a war, and by that also drag the U.S. into the war. And the Biden administration has firmly pushed back against that. But the best way of actually completely eliminating or largely eliminating the risk of that war is to get a ceasefire in Gaza. And now it's been 10 months and we don't have a ceasefire. And it's frankly, in some ways, quite lucky that this exchange of fire between Hezbollah and Israel has not yet led to a larger war.
Yeah, so 12 casualties, kids and teenagers in this strike. The deadliest attack, I believe, on Israel since the events of October 7th. So what role is and should the U.S. play if we're going to stop this from spiraling into all-out war?
Well, first, we have to be clear, though, that it's not entirely clear whether this was a Hezbollah attack or whether it was a malfunctioning Iron Dome missile that hit. There's been, precisely at that location, there's been malfunctioning at the Iron Dome before.
And Hezbollah has denied responsibility, correct?
Exactly. They deny responsibility. And we don't know yet, although apparently the White House has been very quick to determine who's behind this, which is interesting, mindful of how many months it's taken them to not yet even determine who has been behind several other attacks in which Israel has been accused of being the attacker. But I think, so for instance, the Europeans called for an independent investigation. I think they did so partly because they may doubt that Hezbollah was behind it, or partly because they think Hezbollah is behind it, but they want to use the extra time to be able to find a way to de-escalate. So you asked what the U.S. should do. Well, I think the Biden administration is actually privately behind the scenes putting pressure on Israel not to take this too far, precisely because of the fear that this will lead into the Iranians getting into the war. And if the Iranians get into the war, the U.S. is going to feel very compelled, just as it was after October 7th, to strongly support Israel, potentially even getting involved in the war. And from a U.S. standpoint, from a U.S. national security standpoint, this is absolutely something that needs to be avoided. We cannot get dragged into another war in the region, and we do have the leverage to be able to prevent this escalation. I wrote a piece together with a colleague of mine about a week ago in foreign policy, pointing out that even though there may not be much room for or appetite for nuclear diplomacy between Iran and the United States, given the new Iranian president and his willingness to talk, but even though there may not be appetite for nuclear talks, there's a more pressing issue at hand, and that is preventing an escalation between Israel and Lebanon. And that's all before this latest incident. And I think if the US and Iran were to talk, it actually would dramatically help intensify and make the diplomacy more efficient to make sure that this is prevented. Both of them can put pressure on their partners in this. The US obviously has the leverage to put pressure on Israel, and the Iranians certainly have leverage to put pressure on Hezbollah.
Let's talk about the complexity of the community impacted by this. Now, in 1967, you had Israel seize this land. It is considered illegally occupied territory by the United Nations. There's about 20,000 Arab Druze in this area. Most of them have rejected the idea of Israeli citizenship. What does it mean that Arab Jews Druze were impacted by this attack?
Well, the Druze is a population that oftentimes has been caught in the crossfire here, but it is quite correct what you're pointing out. This is occupied territory. I don't know why the NSC referred to it as Northern Israel. This is occupied territory, and it is recognized as being occupied territory. And the population that lives there, as you pointed out, has refused Israeli citizenship, precisely because they don't recognize being part of Israel. So it is another one of the complexities in the Middle East. But in some ways, had there actually been an attack, if it's been certified there was an attack, and it was this deadly against children, and it actually was in Israel proper, the risk of escalation would be even greater than it is today.
Do we know how Netanyahu's visit last week has affected the situation in the Middle East and any strategic decision-making that is going on or coordination between Israel, the U.S. with respect to Gaza?
I think Netanyahu got a pretty clear message from Kamala Harris. I think the body language was quite clear. I suspect that the private meeting was even more clear. It's a clear break from the way that the Biden administration has pursued this. If you take note of what she said in the open comments, she, during her presentation there, said that she had told Netanyahu was standing right next to her, she had said to him, clinch the deal. This is very important because the Biden administration strategy has been to privately put pressure on Israel, but publicly blame Hamas for the lack of a ceasefire. It's clearly not been effective. It is recognized inside of Israel that Netanyahu is the obstacle, that he doesn't want to get a ceasefire. And it could be for many different reasons, including the fact that he has members of his coalition that may walk out of his coalition if he agrees to a ceasefire. But publicly, the U.S. has been blaming Hamas rather than Netanyahu. Kamala Harris kind of broke with that. She didn't explicitly blame him, but she made it very clear who the actual obstacle is by saying to him, clinch the deal, meaning the deal is on the table. It's his answer that we're waiting for. So I think this has clearly sent a message to the region as a whole that there's likely going to be some form of a shift in U.S. policy. Now, at this stage, of course, it's only a rhetorical what Kamala Harris can do. But I think that actually increases the likelihood of the Iranians putting pressure on Hezbollah for making sure that there doesn't go to a larger war. They don't want to see a larger war. And if they see movement on the American side towards an actual ceasefire by actually putting real pressure on Israel publicly and privately, I think that actually helps making sure that the others also show restraint.
Trita Parsi, thank you so much for coming on and breaking this down.
Thank you so much for having me.